Hi there, this is David from DTU, from the Technical University of Denmark. Welcome to this session. In this session, I want to talk about prevalence. Prevalence is a core concept in epidemiology. It's a very often used point estimate to determine the burden of a certain disease in a population. It can be seen as a snapshot when you want to know the disease in a certain population or certain characteristic in a certain population. And when you don't know anything about it, the often method to start to know about that particular disease is through the estimation of the prevalence. And this is what we are going to see in this session. So the title is Estimation of the Apparent Prevalence. This session belongs to the module called Data Management for Epidemiological Analysis. So what are the learning objectives? So the learning objectives is that by the end of this lecture, you should be able to execute the estimation of the apparent prevalence. You will recall as well how to calculate the apparent prevalence, and you will be able to interpret the point estimate of this apparent prevalence. So what is the plan for this lesson? So we will first describe some key characteristics of the prevalence. We will then see how we can calculate it and how we can interpret the apparent prevalence. Let's start by defining what is apparent prevalence. So prevalence is defined as it is called also prevalence rate or point prevalence. And what it tells a proportion of individuals in a population having a disease or an attribute at a specific point in time. As you recall, in the title of this presentation, I talk about apparent prevalence. And I'm just referring now to prevalence in general. And I say apparent prevalence because sometimes the methods we use to define whether an individual is diseased or not is not always perfect. So there is certain uncertainty when we define someone as a disease or not. So only when we are completely certain we can talk about true prevalence. We will talk about that later. My colleague Mariana is going to explain you all about how to estimate the true prevalence. In this case, I'm just considering the apparent prevalence, and I will refer to this lecture just as a prevalence for short. So how can we estimate the prevalence? So before I explain how to determine the prevalence, let me introduce a simple study which is very often used to determine the prevalence. The study is called the cross-sectional study. And this is a study you might encounter when you want to do a prevalence study, a prevalence point estimation. In a cross-sectional study, you have a population of interest. You are interested in a population for determine certain disease or characteristic. And then you measure that characteristic of disease. And what you do is you register the cases of diseased individuals or the no disease individuals. They can be people, can be animals, so it can be even plants. So let me show an example of this. Imagine we have a study population of 2,000 individuals, and we want to investigate whether they are diseased or not. And we do this by sending a letter, and we ask them whether they have or whether they are diseased or not. And then we register the proportion of diseased people, the ones who were diseased and the ones who were not diseased. So this is basically how a cross-sectional study is done. Sometimes we can call it as a survey. And so this information is going to have to be used to calculate the point estimate called prevalence. So how we estimate the prevalence? The apparent prevalence is determined in the following way. We have these parameters that we have to estimate. What is A? Well, A is the disease individuals in the population, and the total population is A plus B. So the prevalence is the proportion of diseased people in a population. So let's see an example. Say we have a study population of the same 2,000 individuals, and we investigate whether they are diseased or not, and then we do this by sending SMS message or even calling them to their mobile phones. And then we register the proportion of the number of individuals who are diseased. And the outcomes were like you received the information that 376 were diseased. Sorry about the misspelling there. And what is the prevalence? Well, the prevalence is that we have 376 divided by 2,000, and we multiply this value by 100. So the apparent prevalence, so the prevalence, the point estimate is 18.8. We can round it to 19. So what does 19 means? Well, it's 19%. So 19 out of 100 have the particular disease we were interested in investigating. In other words, the prevalence can be described as a probability that at random we select one individual from this population and then we will obtain 19 out of 100 who are going to be suffering from this disease. What are some characteristics of the prevalence? Well, the prevalence, the study to obtain the prevalence is relatively inexpensive. As I mentioned, can be considered as a survey, and it gives you a quick way of to determining the situation in a population. What is the health status in a certain population? When you don't have any previous information, it's quite useful. Another important characteristic is that it's often used to assess chronic diseases. And this is because with other methods like incidence, which is shown as well in this module, sometimes we don't know exactly when a particular chronic disease has started. Think about, for instance, arthritis. It's very difficult to determine the exact moment when a chronic disease started in one person. So when we estimate prevalence, we also include pre-existing cases of Lyme disease. And I have an example of myself. When I was a very little one, I had what is called Shigella. And if you take a sample from my body, a blood sample, you will still find antibodies against Shigellosis. It means that if somebody is doing a survey in the community where I live now and find that I am one of those who has been with Shigellosis, well, I'm not a new one on Shigellosis and I'm not suffering the disease at all, but I will count as a case as a part of the numerator. So this also is related when we have, for instance, a high prevalence. A high prevalence may indicate that we have either a high incidence or that the disease has a long survival. Think, for instance, diabetes. It has a long survival, well, relatively long compared to others, let's say. On the other hand, a low prevalence may indicate either we have a low incidence or a deadly disease with a rapid recovery. A rapid recovery can be, for instance, a common cold, which over 2 weeks or even a week you might be recovered, or it can be a very deadly disease, um, which can be anything you like. Can be a poison or something very infectious and deadly. One important thing that is worth mentioning is that prevalence is often very confused with incidence. So there are two separate things. In this model, we are talking about incidence. So don't confuse about incidence and prevalence. So when you talk about prevalence, you know exactly what we are talking about now, and incidence is something else. So in this lecture, we have learned about what is called the apparent prevalence, and we saw how can calculate the estimate of the apparent prevalence. We saw the formula, and you can examine some properties of this estimate. We saw these properties, and you know how to interpret this prevalence because it's a proportion, and we multiply this by 100, and so we know the percentage of people or animals or anything else with a certain characteristic or a disease. So it's time to do some quizzes and exercises.